Picture this. It's 1964, and you're standing at the starting line of the Daytona 500. The green flag drops, and suddenly there's a sound unlike anything NASCAR has ever heard. It's not just loud. It's violent, primal, almost angry. 4 Plymouth Furies sweep past the competition like they're standing still. First place, second place, third place. The crowd goes silent. NASCAR officials scramble for their rule books. Something impossible just happened. Richard Petty's Plymouth crosses the finish line doing 174 miles per hour, nearly 20 miles per hour faster than anything else on the track. His engine, a mysterious new power plant that Chrysler engineers had been developing in absolute secrecy. Within hours, Ford and Chevrolet are screaming bloody murder. Within days, NASCAR bans the engine entirely. Within months, it becomes the most feared, most coveted, most legendary engine in American automotive history. This is the story of the 426 HEMI, an engine so powerful, so dominant, so utterly devastating that racing organizations literally rewrote their rules to stop it. An engine that street racers called the Elephant, because when one showed up, everything else became irrelevant. An engine that cost 3 times what a small block V8 did, required premium fuel just to idle, and could destroy its own drivetrain if you weren't careful with the throttle. But here's where it gets interesting. The 426 HEMI wasn't supposed to exist at all. To understand why Chrysler built something so extreme, we need to travel back to the early 1960s. Ford and General Motors dominated both the showrooms and the racetracks. Chrysler was hemorrhaging market share. Their engines were reliable but boring. Their cars were well built but uninspiring. Company executives knew that racing success translated directly to showroom sales. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Wasn't just a saying, it was proven business strategy. In 1962, Chrysler's racing program was a joke. Their best effort at Daytona saw them finish 14 seconds behind the winner. In NASCAR's Grand National Series, they won exactly 3 races all season, while Ford and Chevy split the other 50. Something drastic had to be done. Enter Tom Hoover, a soft-spoken engineer who'd been quietly experimenting with hemispherical combustion chambers in Chrysler's Highland Park facility. Hoover understood something fundamental about engine design that his competitors had overlooked. The shape of the combustion chamber, the space where fuel and air explode to push the piston down, determines everything about an engine's potential. Most engines used wedge-shaped chambers because they were cheap to manufacture. But Hoover knew that a hemispherical chamber shaped like half of a sphere allowed for larger valves, better airflow, and more complete combustion. Chrysler had actually built HEMI engines before, back in the 1950s. The original firepower HEMI produced 180 horsepower from 331 cubic inches. Impressive for 1951, but nothing revolutionary. Those early HEMIs were heavy, complex, and expensive to build. By 1958, Chrysler abandoned the design entirely, switching to cheaper wedge-head engines like everyone else. But Hoover believed the concept had untapped potential. With racing manager Bob Rogers backing, he assembled a team of 8 engineers in a locked section of the engine lab. Their mission was classified even within Chrysler. The budget was unlimited. The deadline was impossible. They had less than 1 year to develop, test, and prepare engines for the 1964 Daytona 500. The team started with a clean sheet design. Everything about this engine would be purpose-built for maximum power. The block would be cast from high-strength iron with reinforced main bearing webs. The crankshaft would be forged from premium steel, cross-drilled for oiling, and balanced to perfection. The connecting rods would be shot-peened for strength, but the real magic happened up top. The hemispherical combustion chambers were engineering artwork. Each chamber was perfectly machined to create optimal flame propagation. The valves were massive, 2.25 inches on the intake side, 1.94 inches for exhaust. For comparison, a contemporary Chevy 427 used 2.19-inch intake valves. That might not sound like much difference, but in airflow terms, it was like comparing a garden hose to a fire hose. The valve angle was crucial. At 58 degrees included angle, the valves formed a wide V. that allowed incoming air and fuel to flow straight down into the cylinder with minimal turbulence. The spark plug sat right in the center of the chamber, equidistant from all the edges, ensuring even flame spread. The compression ratio was set at 12.5:1 for race trim, so high that it required 103 octane fuel minimum. But raw airflow meant nothing without the valve timing to exploit it. The camshaft profile was absolutely radical for 1963. The intake valves opened 46 degrees before top dead center and didn't close until 72 degrees after bottom dead center. That's 298 degrees of duration. The valves were open for more than 3/4 of the entire four-stroke cycle. The overlap period when both intake and exhaust valves were open simultaneously lasted an incredible 86 degrees. Think about that for a second. In a normal street engine, overlap might be 20 to 40 degrees. This thing had 86 degrees where exhaust was still leaving while fresh mixture was already coming in. At low RPM, this made the engine run terribly. Rough, idle, poor fuel economy. No vacuum for power brakes. But at 6,000 RPM and above, it turned the engine into an air pump of devastating efficiency. The intake manifold was another masterpiece. Cast from aluminum to save weight, it featured two massive 4-barrel carburetors mounted in line. Each carburetor flowed 600 cubic feet per minute. Together, they could supply enough air and fuel mixture for nearly 1,000 horsepower. The runners were tuned for 6,500 RPM peak power, with smooth transitions and matched ports that looked like they'd been sculpted by an artist who understood fluid dynamics. Initial dyno testing in late 1963 shocked even Hoover's team. The engine produced 425 horsepower at 6,000 RPM and 480 pound-feet of torque at 4,600 RPM. But those were conservative numbers with mild tuning. When they leaned on it hard, with race gas and aggressive timing, they saw 550 horsepower. Some test pulls touched 600. Let me put that in perspective. Ford's best race engine, the 427 High Riser, made about 480 horsepower in full race trim. Chevy's mystery motor 427, their absolute best effort, peaked around 520. The Hemi was making 15 to 20% more power from smaller displacement. It wasn't just better, it was revolutionary. Chrysler quietly built 110 race engines for the 1964 season. They distributed them to select teams with strict instructions. No publicity, no bragging, no hints to the competition. The engines were installed in Plymouth Fury and Dodge Polara bodies that had been acid dipped to remove weight and fitted with aluminum bumpers and plexiglass windows. The cars looked stock from the grandstands, but they were purpose-built racing machines. When they fired up for practice at Daytona, every crew chief in the garage area knew something fundamental had changed. The sound was different, deeper, angrier, with a sharp bark that cut through the noise of 30 other race cars. In qualifying, Paul Goldsmith's Hemi Plymouth turned a lap at a 174th 10 minute pace. The previous year's pole speed had been 160.943. He was nearly 14 miles per hour faster, but speed was only part of the story. The Hemi's broad torque curve meant drivers could run a taller gear ratio, reducing engine RPM on the high banks. While Ford and Chevy drivers were spinning their engines at 7,200 tolerant RPM and praying they'd survive 500 miles, the Hemis were loafing along at 6,500 RPM with power to spare. Reliability became a weapon. The result was total domination. Plymouth took the first 3 spots at Daytona. Richard Petty won by a full lap. In the following weeks, Hemi-powered cars won at Phoenix, at North Wilkesboro, at Martinsville. By mid-season, they'd won 26 of 37 races. Ford and General Motors threatened to withdraw from NASCAR entirely unless something was done. NASCAR's France family faced a crisis. If Ford and GM pulled out, the sport would collapse, but Chrysler had followed the rules. The 426 was based on a production block, used stock bore spacing, and met displacement regulations. Their solution was creative, if controversial. For 1965, NASCAR required any engine used in racing to be available in regular production cars. minimum 500 units for the public. Chrysler's executives faced a dilemma. Building 500 Street HEMIs would be expensive. The engine required special assembly procedures, premium materials, and extensive testing. Each one would cost far more to produce than they could reasonably charge. But retreating from NASCAR after such dominant success would be a PR disaster. So they did something unprecedented. They built a street version of their race engine with almost no compromises. The 1966 Street HEMI was barely civilized. Compression dropped from 12.51 to 1025.1. Still higher than most race engines today, the Wild Race Cam was replaced with a slightly milder profile, 276 degrees intake duration, 284 degrees exhaust. Still radical by any street standard, the dual quads remained, though they were slightly smaller at 585 CFM each. The engine was rated at 425 horsepower at 5,000 RPM and 490 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 RPM. Everyone knew these numbers were laughably conservative. Chrysler was terrified of insurance companies and liability lawsuits. Real-world dyno tests showed 490 to 520 horsepower, depending on tune. Installing a Street HEMI required massive modifications to the car. The stock suspension couldn't handle the weight. The engine was 100 pounds heavier than a 440. The stock transmission would grenada under full throttle launches. The rear axle needed upgrading. The cooling system required expansion. The battery had to be relocated to the trunk for weight distribution. The option price was staggering. In 1966, a Street HEMI added $907.60 to the price of a Plymouth Satellite. Roughly $8,500 in today's money. That was more than a third of the car's base price. For comparison, Chevy's 427 option cost $437.10. Ford's 428 Cobra Jet was $420. You could literally buy a second car for what the HEMI option cost, but the price was only the beginning of ownership challenges. The engine required premium fuel, 100 octane minimum, 103 preferred. At idle, the radical cam caused such poor vacuum that power brakes barely functioned. The engine was cold-blooded, requiring extensive warm-up before it would run properly. Spark plugs fouled constantly in traffic. Gas mileage was single digits. The clutch was heavy enough to give you a leg workout. And then there was the torque. The 426 MI produced so much twist that it regularly broke everything behind it. Donna 60 rear axles twisted like pretzels. 4-speed transmissions exploded their cases. U-joints snapped. Drive shafts turned into pretzels. One famous incident involved a road runner that literally twisted its unibody structure under hard acceleration, creating permanent wrinkles in the roof. Professional drag racers quickly learned the HEMI's potential. Sox and Martin's Plymouth Barracuda became the first factory superstock car to break into the 10-second quarter-mile range. Their driver, Ronnie Sox, could launch so hard that both front wheels would lift 3 feet off the ground. The crowd would gasp as the car carried the wheels for 60 feet before slamming back down. Don Garlitz bolted a HEMI into his Swamp Rat 6 dragster and immediately ran 7.88 seconds at 192 mph, obliterating his previous personal best. He said later that the HEMI had so much power it actually scared him, and Garlitz was a man who'd already survived multiple dragster explosions, but the street racing scene was where the HEMI earned its nickname, the Elephant. When one showed up at a stoplight confrontation, smart money walked away. The engine's combination of displacement, breathing, and RPM capability meant it could be built to absolutely absurd power levels. While a worked small block might make 400 horsepower, a built HEMI could touch 700 with 1960s technology. The mystique grew with every street race victory. Stories spread of HEMI cars running away from everything. Corvettes, Cobras, GTOs, all left in the dust. Some were true, some exaggerated, but the reputation became self-fulfilling. Just having a HEMI under the hood was psychological warfare. Insurance companies caught on quickly. By 1970, some companies simply refused to insure HEMI cars. Others charged premiums that exceeded monthly car payments. A 22-year-old male with a HEMI CUDA might pay $3,000 annually for insurance, more than half what the entire car cost. The high cost kept production numbers low. In 1966, Chrysler built just 468 Street HEMIs. In 1967, only 661. The peak came in 1970 with about 2,500 units across all models. Total Street HEMI production from 1966 to 1971 was roughly 11,000 engines, fewer than Ford builds F-150s in 3 days today. Each year, Chrysler refined the package slightly. The 1968 models got improved valve springs and different rocker arms. The 1969 engines received a hotter cam and revised pistons. The 1970 version got improved breathing with revised ports, but the basic architecture remained unchanged. It was essentially a race engine with a warranty. The engineering details that made the Hemi so powerful deserve deeper examination. The hemispherical chamber wasn't just about valve size, it was about flame propagation and thermal efficiency. As the spark plug fired, the flame front expanded uniformly in all directions like a perfect sphere. In a wedge chamber, the flame had to travel different distances to reach the edges, creating hot spots and detonation risk. The Hemi's chamber shape also reduced the surface-to-volume ratio. Less surface area meant less heat loss to the coolant, keeping more energy in the combustion event. The smooth dome shape eliminated sharp edges where carbon could accumulate or create hot spots. Even the piston crown was carefully shaped. A smooth dome that matched the chamber contour with precise quench areas to promote turbulence. The valve arrangement was geometrically optimal. With the valves canted at opposing angles, intake and exhaust flows never had to make sharp turns. Air and fuel flowed straight down through the intake valve, made a smooth 180-degree turn at the piston, and exited straight up through the exhaust valve. No shrouding, no flow separation, no tumble losses. The rocker arm system was another piece of engineering elegance. Unlike conventional engines that used a single rocker shaft, the Hemi used two separate shafts, one for intake and one for exhaust. This allowed perfect valve geometry throughout the lift cycle. The rocker ratio was 1.5:1, multiplying cam lift to achieve massive valve opening without overstressing the cam lobes. Even the oiling system was race-derived. The main oil gallery ran down the center of the block, not offset like conventional designs. This provided equal oil pressure to all bearings. The lifters were fed by dedicated galleries with restrictors to prevent over-oiling. The rocker shafts had precisely sized orifices to spray oil directly onto the valve stems and springs. Every drop of oil had a purpose. The Hemi's connecting rods deserve special mention. Forged from 440 chrome moly steel, they were shot-peened for fatigue resistance and magnifluxed for cracks. The big end used fractured cap technology. The rod and cap were forged as one piece, then literally cracked apart. When bolted back together, the irregular surfaces locked perfectly, preventing cap walk under extreme loads. The crankshaft was a masterpiece of metallurgy. Forged from 5140 steel, it was heat-treated to a specific hardness gradient. Harder at the journals for wear resistance, slightly softer in the body for fatigue resistance. Every journal was cross-drilled for oiling. The counterweights were positioned for optimal balance. The whole assembly was so strong that many survived 8,000 RPM pulls in drag racing applications. But perhaps the most impressive aspect was the Hemi's untapped potential. The stock Street Hemi was built to survive warranty claims, not win races. The compression was mild, the cam was conservative, the carburetors were small. Racers immediately discovered that simple modifications unleashed shocking power gains. Installing headers instead of the restrictive stock manifolds was worth 40 horsepower. A bigger cam could add 60 horsepower. Raising compression to 13.1 added another 50. Port work and larger valves could find 40 more. Suddenly you had a 650 horsepower street engine with 1960s technology. No wonder they dominated everything they entered. The Hemi's weakness, if you could call it that, was its complexity. The engine had nearly twice as many rocker arms as a conventional V8. The dual valve springs required precise installation. The valve adjustment procedure was time-consuming and critical. A mistake during assembly could destroy the engine in seconds. Professional mechanics commanded premium rates for Hemi work. A valve adjustment that cost $20 for a small block might be $75 for a Hemi. A rebuild that cost $800 for a 440 could reach $2,500 for a Hemi. Parts were expensive when you could find them. Racing parts were often easier to source than stock components. The Street HEMI's final year was 1971, killed by tightening emissions regulations and rising insurance costs. The Clean Air Act required lower compression and milder cams, antithetical to the Hemi's very nature. Chrysler could have built a neutered version, but that would have destroyed the legend. Better to retire undefeated. The aftermath was immediate collector interest. By 1975, clean Hemi cars were already commanding premium prices. By 1980, they were investment-grade collectibles. Today, an original numbers-matching Hemi Cuda convertible can sell for over $4 million. Even rough project cars command six figures. But the story doesn't end in 1971. The Hemi's influence rippled through decades of engine development. Ford's Boss 429 was a direct response to the Hemi threat. Chevrolet's ZL1 Aluminum 427 was their attempt to out-Hemi the Hemi. Even modern engines show Hemi DNA: high-flowing heads, aggressive cam timing, optimized chamber shapes. When Chrysler revived the Hemi name in 2003, purists scoffed. The new engine had 2 spark plugs per cylinder, but conventional wedge chambers. It was a Hemi in marketing only. But the name still carried weight, still implied power and dominance. That's the measure of a true legend, when the name alone becomes valuable. The original 426 Hemi remains the most powerful, naturally aspirated production engine of the muscle car era. It was too powerful for its own good, too expensive for mass production, too wild for everyday driving. It was an engine that shouldn't have existed, built by a company that couldn't afford to lose, for a war that rewrote the rules of American performance. Today's engines make more power more efficiently. Modern technology delivers reliability the Hemi never could, but nothing will ever match the raw, visceral, almost frightening experience of a Ford 26 HEMI at full throttle. The sound, the acceleration, the sense that you're controlling something barely contained. That's why collectors pay millions, why legends persist, why the elephant remains the king of American muscle. The Hemi proved something fundamental about American engineering philosophy. When pushed to the limit, when facing extinction, American engineers don't build something sensible. They build something outrageous, something that doesn't just win, but dominates so thoroughly that the rules have to be changed, something that becomes legend, not despite its impracticality, but because of it. That's the real lesson of the 426 Hemi. Sometimes too powerful is exactly powerful enough. Sometimes the correct answer to how much horsepower is simply yes. Sometimes you need to build something so extreme that it changes everything. What's the most powerful engine you've ever experienced? Drop a comment below and share your story. If you enjoyed this deep dive into American engineering excess, hit that subscribe button for more legendary engine stories. Until next time, keep those engines running, and remember, there's no replacement for displacement, especially when it's topped with hemispherical combustion chambers.